Paul Appleby, welcome to the podcast. Do you mind giving us a bit of a rundown about your background and what you're currently doing at Virtana?
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for having me. It's kind of fun to have a conversation, although I'm not used to talking about myself, so I'll try and do the best that I can. As you can tell from the accent, I'm not American. I'm originally from Australia. Grew up in Oz and developed my career in Oz. Interestingly, found my way into technology from university, and it wasn't the path that I intended, but ended up working in the tech sector and worked in some companies, some of which don't exist anymore. In the great relational database wars of the late 80s, early 90s, and to some companies that still exist, like SAP. I was a big part of growing and scaling SAP. Siebel Systems, which of course doesn't exist anymore, got acquired by Oracle, but famously run by Tom Siebel, who's a bit of an industry legend. And of course, Salesforce, speaking of industry legends, Mark Benioff was a big part of growing and scaling that business. For me, it's been a really fun journey of kind of starting in Australia, then in Asia Pac, and then growing into global roles. And living here in the US now for 15 years, you probably pick up a little bit of US twang there. I try not to have it, but it makes its way in there. But it's been a wonderful journey, helping scale and grow tech companies, including a couple of startups along the way, and meeting a few industry legends. Right now, I'm running a company as CEO called Virtana Corp. It's an applied AI company. Interesting fun fact about this company is that prior CEO, a couple of CEOs ago, was a guy called John Thompson, who famously was chairman of Microsoft for many years. So I'm filling some pretty big shoes there, man, and pretty excited to be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, it's a serious history and background. I mean, getting to this point, you've worked multiple very large companies, billion-dollar companies. So it's been, I guess, obviously it'd be interesting to I guess dive into how you got into those companies to begin with, and then how your role grew up until CEO. So I guess, how did you get into one of your first big companies, and then obviously transition from there?
Yeah, interestingly, it was all very much about relationships and building relationships. I think about every role I've had, and it was funny. I was asked, some time ago. I think it was when I was coming into Virtana, whether I could provide a copy of my CV, and I said, "Well, I'll see if I can find one." And the one that I found was dated from the early '90s, and I hadn't updated my CV since then. And the reason being is that every role that I've had has come to me as a result of relationships that I have, former colleagues, board members, recruiting consultants that I've met over the years. So I think, one thing that I would say is really, really consistent is that if we think about the span of what our career might look like, building relationships in the early days of your career of people who might be coaches or mentors or people who might be able to recommend you for opportunities in the future is really, really key. So when I think about how I came into SAP, that's exactly how I joined SAP in the early 90s. It was through a relationship that I developed with a major recruiting consultant, and we'd been nurturing that relationship for 3 or 4 years. And then ultimately he recommended me for that role. Other jobs that I've gotten into have really come about through board members recommending me to CEOs. So I've been very lucky there. But I think the important thing to note is that we get to make our luck. So people might say, "Wow, that's really lucky that you got recommended." Well, you got to nurture those relationships. You got to really invest in those relationships, and that's how I've been able to kind of grow and scale over time.
Yeah, it's super important, the relationship piece, and I hear it from a lot of the guests that we have on, relationships are one of the keys.
Can't do
And
it
not
by
everything,
yourself. Can't
but
do it by yourself, mate. I think
yeah,
that's the really important things. You know, if I was to talk about leadership, somebody asked me a question recently. You know, how can I make it? How do I assess good leaders? The very first thing I do is look at the people they surround themselves with. Great leaders surround themselves with great people, and great leaders surround themselves with a diversity of opinions. So you don't want an echo chamber. You want a group of people around you who are going to challenge your thinking, challenge your beliefs, you know, and sometimes get you to change those opinions and those beliefs and you know, take a different direction. So that I think is absolutely key.
totally, that's good. So in terms of I guess across your career, what have been, and I want to get into some details in terms of,
Mhm.
we mentioned before the podcast, scaling a company from around 400, 500 million a year up until a billion. So I'd love to hear about that. But what have been some of, in your eyes, because people can look at it and just look at the monetary figure and say, wow, that's incredible. But what have been some of the real big successes that have stood out for you?
Um, You know, what I'd say is I'd look at themes rather than just specific instances, and I think there are themes that are consistent across all of those experiences that I've had. The first thing is that I'm very particular about the companies that I pick, and when I say in particular, I look at companies that are solving big complex problems that really matter for customers. So like how important is the problem that they're solving? How material is that? And are the dynamics around that problem scaling or contracting? Because if you have a big problem that is really material to solve, the dynamics around that problem are growing and they cross industry and geographic boundaries, you can then grow and scale a company. Now, the final thing you look for is product market fit. So, if all of those things are true, does the company have a great solution for that? Even if it's a small company, it doesn't really matter because there's the potential to grow and scale a business. The second piece then is the team you build around you. And that's been a constant for me wherever I've gone is that, you know, if I'm going to, you know, take this company from 400 million to 1.2 billion, or in another case from 2 billion to 5 billion, what is the set of skills that I need around me to help me grow and scale that business? So being really, really purposeful in how you grow and scale a team, both from within the company, because there's always amazing talent in every company you go to, but also identifying gaps and bringing people in, potentially that you've worked with before, but not always people you've worked with before. The third piece is then strategy. How am I going to unlock that potential? We've got great product market fit. We've got a great potential market. We've built a great team. What is our strategy for going after that? And there's no one size fits all. You know, what worked at, say SAP is not necessarily what's going to work at Salesforce. They were very, very different businesses. So we take elements of what we've learned in each of those experiences, but also look at the unique aspects of the business and build a very, very specific strategy that is really intentional in terms of how you're going to grow and scale. Because 2 to 5 billion is not like, you know, it's not a simple thing. It's not a simple exercise. So you need to think about what are the foundational elements I need to put in place to be able to grow and scale this business. And to do that, I use a kind of somewhat modified worldview of what's called the McKinsey 3 Horizon model. And it's well worth, if you're not familiar with it, it's well worth having a look at it. But it's really understanding what's the current state of my business. Where do I really want to be in, you know, a given period of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And then what are the phases that I can go through, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, and being very intentional about what am I going to build? How am I going to execute? What are the resources I need to go through each phase? So then, you know, that whole idea of a journey from 2 billion to 5 billion or 400 million to 1.2 billion is really, really concrete and laid out for the team, because then you've got intentionality and everybody can align around what they've got to do and the role they've got to play.
Amazing, Paul. So a lot to go into there. But at the start, obviously, you mentioned picking the right company. I thoroughly agree, obviously, with that point. I think a lot of companies are trying to maybe scale in a way or try and grow their revenue, and they're trying to force it, but the market's not there, the product's not there. Obviously, product market fit, the companies that you've worked at have had an excellent product. So I guess in terms of that, what would you say is, for an entrepreneur, CEO picking the next opportunity to go into, or looking at their current opportunity, how would they assess the market, the product market fit, and the potential for growth? Is there any thought process behind that?
Yeah, I mean, how long have we got? How long did you say? Is this going to be a multi-session series in the podcast?
It may
I'll try,
be
I'll
part
try
one.
and I'll try and keep it as straightforward as possible. I try and look before I start going, hey, I want to be in this particular space. Now let me go and understand the market dynamics. I look at the broad market dynamics. What are the things that are at a macro level going on, and that are driving technology decisions? So let's talk about some of these things. We don't talk about it in the press as much anymore, but the whole idea of digital transformation is a reality for the global 2000. Large enterprises, whether they're large enterprises in Australia, in Asia, in Europe, or in America, that whole idea of digitization of services at scale is a reality. And we live those digitized services on a daily basis to book our Uber, book our airline, do our banking, whatever the case may be. So digitization of services, the large scale rollout of industrial IoT. Now, again, there was a period of time we were talking about IoT a lot. We don't talk about it a lot anymore. Doesn't mean it's not happening. It is. So mega scale IoT programs. And then in parallel with that, we've seen the change in the nature of work. So, first remote work and now hybrid work. And then finally, and really importantly, AI. These are kind of the mega themes that are going on in the marketplace. So as you start to think about a market, I want to look for technology companies that are tapping into those themes somewhere, and that have a unique solution, maybe not to every one of those problems, but to the challenges we're dealing with today. So if I look, for example, at my own company, Virtana, where I'm the CEO, we live at the crossroads of driving service availability, leveraging AI. So like if you're any large company that has critical business services, somebody like a big bank in Australia, Combank or Telstra, and I could go on and on and on, name any other company, they're the kinds of companies, I'm not saying they're customers because neither of them actually are, but they're equivalent in the US and in Europe, are our customers, where our technology ensures that those services stay available, leveraging the power of AI to actually drive strategies for remediation and delivering uptime. So for me, looking at the space I'm in, I think the global addressable market that I'm in is about 120 billion. So, and it's expanding at 20% year on year. You look at a market like that and you go, wow, if you've got a great product and you've got really good product market fit, you could grow a really material company in that space. Make sense?
Makes sense.
Well,
Makes a lot of sense.
so for any entrepreneur thinking about entering a space, it's like, what are the macro trends? What are the problems that are created by those macro trends? One thing I didn't in fact touch on is the nature of enterprise computing is now fully hybrid. So like, how do we deliver all of those outcomes in a hybrid, compute construct? All of those things, drive opportunities. So can I key into one or many of those opportunities? Then you can build a big business.
Amazing. I mean, we're limited on time today, but we will leave it at that and maybe touch on those points in another episode.
Yeah, I
So
tried to be as quick as I could on a very, very
yeah,
complex question.
yeah, no, I love it. I love it. So in terms of obviously being a CEO is quite a challenge. Obviously, you're dealing with every single I guess large problem will come onto your desk in most cases. How do you set yourself up for success? Because obviously, being and performing at your best, you have to have certain habits and do certain things personally to be able to do that. Do you have any set, I guess, structural routines that you follow to perform at your best?
Yep. Um, I'm going to come back to the point I made earlier because I think it's really important to reference, and that's team is everything. The better your team is, the better the outcome's going to be. So the more space it creates for you. I've beaten that drum enough. I'll talk about some of the personal habits. I think it's very easy to be totally consumed by the work. So, I talked a bit about intentionality in terms of strategy, team, execution. You have to be really intentional about self. So for me, I get up early every morning. I spend about an hour, doing some combination of yoga, meditation, working out, or a combination of all three. And I think it's really an important way to start the day because it kind of gets you in the right kind of mental space to kind of take on all of the challenges that you need to address, whether that's a new competitor, whether it's an issue within the team or the company, whether it's some financial challenge that you're dealing with. I think being in a good place physically and mentally is really, really key to being a good leader because you want to show up when you're with your team, when you're with your customers, when you're working with partners, you really want to show up. And people are looking for their leader to show up and to really be really present. So to me, that's a really, really key thing. So, taking time for self makes you a better human.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. In terms of, I guess, your growth, I guess over the journey, like taking a company from around 500 million to 1.2 billion, you mentioned. What were some of the strategies? Don't have to go super in depth, but at a high level, what were some of those key strategies that enabled you to be able to take that company and pretty much double the revenue?
Yeah, I mentioned some of them, having the right team. But in this situation where you're talking about scale, so I'm not talking about startup now, different set of challenges, different strategy. Here we're talking about a company that's achieved reasonable scale, but is looking to go to the next phase. And the key is to create multiple vectors for growth. So you can't be putting all of your eggs in one basket. You really need to identify where can I create acceleration for growth, and that's where you start to think about alternate strategies. In the particular example that we're talking about, I saw there was a huge opportunity not only to continue to evolve the direct sales approach for the kind of Fortune 500, Global 2000 style companies, but an opportunity to create a mid-market and SMB strategy that was very, very different and driven by AI, automation, self-service, the classic kind of SaaS see, try, buy model. So now we've got two modalities. We've got a big enterprise approach and we've got a mid-market approach. But then the third factor was that this technology lent itself very well to being distributed by third parties. So in this particular instance, it was the cloud hyperscalers who were the right partners. Companies like AWS, Google, you with GCP, and of course Microsoft with Azure, developing a strategy for distributing through those channels. Now, the fascinating thing about that is, we're a $400 million company. These companies are hundreds of billions of dollars. So if you're able to unlock that channel, it becomes a force multiplier. So that to me was critical. So now you've got three legs of a stool from a strategic perspective. You're still selling to the big corporations directly. You're creating a modern, frictionless motion for the lower end of the market, and you're activating this ecosystem of partners. So all three at once. Now, you might imagine this, it's a pretty complex set of dynamics to drive and set up for, but that's what unlocked the growth from 400 million to 1.2.
Wow. Wow. And obviously within there, there's a whole heap of different things that involved in
how
that.
do you unlock the cloud
Yeah,
hyperscalers
exactly.
is a conversation all by itself, and we can
Yeah,
save that for
yeah.
another day.
We can. We can. So I know we're limited on time today, but for the companies that are maybe in the early stage, maybe they've reached that million ARR mark.
Mhm.
I mean, we could just mention specifically they're a SaaS company or technology company, or just,
Yep.
they're a company in general, could be service based. But
Yep.
how would you, if you were brought in as the CEO, how would you think about taking that company and scaling it to, I mean, as fast as possible, but obviously with sustainable growth?
Yep. Um, what I'd say for young companies is that many of those initial deals, and let's assume this is a tech company selling to enterprises, they got about 1 million in ARR. Um, they're really focused on deal by deal, and it's in many ways it's quite bespoke. You're like, I've got a deal, I'm going to take that and try and win that deal. The key to scale is repeatability. It's actually finding problems that you're really good at solving, particularly if you can find them in an industry. Let's say you're able to solve a problem really well in telco and you win your first telco customer. Well, it's like, how do I learn from that so I can go sell to the next 10 telcos? Because it's a lot easier to do that than it is to go from selling that to a telco to selling to a bank to selling to a retailer. So looking for paths to repeatability is key, because that then unlocks the ability for you as the founder, because in $1 million ARR company, I guarantee you the number one salesperson in the company is the founder or the founders. And to go to scale, you need to unlock that direct relationship between the founder being the number one salesperson to actually hiring a sales team. And the key is repeatability. If you can give them a recipe, you follow this recipe, you have a higher likelihood of being successful. I would encourage that companies think about that. The other thing I would say is don't think about geographic expansion too quickly. Think about how can I expand into near adjacencies as opposed to far adjacencies, because it's just too many young companies try and do that too soon.
Interesting. Okay, so focusing on repeatability, getting a salesperson or building a sales team, giving them that repeatable sales process to be able to scale, and then focusing on your market, expanding first before going overseas.
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Paul, mate, we're going to wrap it up here. This is probably going to be part one of the podcast, but we've got, there could be so much more to talk about, but I really appreciate your time. And obviously if people want to find you, we'll link your LinkedIn in the description. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on, or final comments?
Yeah, what I'd say is, one of the things that I've loved about, living here in the US, and particularly for the 14 years of living in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley, is that there is a real culture of giving back. Like, it's really amazing. Like, people talk about it and you go, well, how real is it? Successful founders in the Bay Area, successful CEOs normally have a group of companies that they just advise because they want to help out and they want to kind of contribute back to young innovators kind of doing their thing. I personally love doing it. So for anybody who's listening, feel free to reach out. You'll find me on LinkedIn. I'll definitely respond. Just reference, Alex and the great work that he's doing, and I'll know how you came to reach out to me, and to the extent I can help, I'll definitely help.
Paul. Thanks for your time.
Hey, thanks, Alex. Good chatting.